Hi, thank you for coming and welcome to the Downtown Dance Collective, where ideas can dance also. And we are looking forward to a wonderfully interesting panel this noontime. But because it's noontime and right in the middle of lunch, I just wanted to take care of a couple of housekeeping details before I introduce everybody. My name is Margaret Kingsland. I used to be the executive director of the Montana Committee for the Humanities, and I have the pleasure of seeing lots of familiar faces, both in the room and at the table here. I want to note I've got some little snack things for the panelists, so you'll excuse them if they need to take some refreshment during this noon hour. And I brought a tin of cookies for the audience, so that tin will be passing around. And please help yourselves and make yourselves comfortable. There's also a water stand up here to the left. This is a panel celebrating 30 years of the last best place, which is still holding up. The world's best doorstop, Lois says. Yes, there's that. And also, so interesting that wherever you open it, even 30 years later, every page has something that you want to read. Every page is interesting. And it is a labor of love, which was the outgrowth of a conference which the Montana Committee for the Humanities organized in 1984. We were doing public programs in the humanities, and we always were aware that anniversaries kind of focus people's attention. And in order to deepen and encourage more reflective and complex conversations about important anniversaries, the Humanities Committee would organize conferences for scholars in which subjects related to what might be coming up could be explored. And we had an eye out for the 1989 centennial of the state of Montana. And we had had experience with the bicentennial of the country and of the Constitution. Would that be right, Ron? Yeah. And so we wanted, the Humanities Committee board and staff wanted to make sure that we weren't just talking about cliches about Montana history while we were celebrating the centennial of statehood. We wanted a more complex conversation about Native peoples and people who were not charismatic leaders, but were history makers and story makers in their own right. So we funded a conference and organized a conference with the planning committee called Montana Myths, Sacred Stories, Sacred Cows. And it was a conference for scholars. And professors of history, philosophy, literature, Native American studies, and other disciplines in the humanities were invited to come to this conference, and we had wonderful speakers both from in-state and out of state. And in that conference, people were so energized and inspired and delighted with meeting people from all over the state and people from outside who had thought in interesting ways about Montana, that I'm going to let Lee Vonek and Bill to discuss some of that. But before I introduce the speakers, I want to express my gratitude to all 5 of the living members of the editorial board who are with us today, some of whom have traveled hundreds of miles to be here. And I'd like to take a moment to pay homage to the 2 members of the editorial board who are not here because they have walked on, Jim Welch and Richard Rader. And happily for us, Lois is here to speak about Jim's work on the editorial board. Before, again, I introduce the editorial board members here on the panel, I want to acknowledge the funders of this project. There were a number of them. A major funder, of course, was the Montana Committee for the Humanities, but the Montana Arts Council also contributed funds for some of the beautiful illustrations, and the coal tax funds, state funds for cultural and aesthetic projects, and the Montana Historical Society Press, and U.S. West, and D.A. Davidson, and the State Centennial Commission were major funders. Important additional contributors who sometimes go unrecognized, but whose work was really significant and valuable in the process, were Jim Todd, who did the beautiful portraits of authors in the book. Arrow Graphics did the typesetting. Kitty Heron and Bill Vaughn must have worked on that. Cher Justo did research on unpublished and out-of-print materials from eastern Montana and other work. Glenda Clay Bradshaw did research on reservations. Kathleen Bogan did the book design, and with Tom Saylor, the cover art. Chris Rancic was the secretary for the project, and Verna Brown was the typist. And if you can imagine being the typist for this, you know we owe her an enormous debt of gratitude, and gratitude to the people who did all of the work on getting permissions and so on. Marianne Keddington and Bill Lang from the Montana Historical Society Press were critically important to this whole effort. In many ways, this anthology was a labor of love, and none of the members of this editorial board were paid. No one received any income or royalties. Hundreds of hours and thousands of miles were given to the project over 4 years. Mileage and lodging were paid by the Montana Committee for the Humanities, and the Montana Committee for the Humanities tried to soften some of the labor of the weekend-long meetings, and there were many of them, by arranging for them to take place in nice places with good food in the shoulder seasons of Chico Hot Springs or Grouse Mountain Lodge or something. So in that spirit, I brought these little snack things for the panelists, and we're going to show them favoritism because we're still grateful, but this is pretty pathetic, I do acknowledge. We've done better, and that was some of the fun of it. Let's see. We met. We met in beautiful places where the landscape of Montana always informed and inspired our work. And if we weren't in a rural setting like the Paradise Valley, then we made sure we were in a meeting room like that beautiful meeting room in the Sleeping Giant Inn in Helena, which has that whole wall of windows. Because the landscape, obviously, is a massive influence on all of our thinking about Montana. And we never took that for granted. It was very much on our minds, and an affirmation of our work. From these labors of many weekends over many years, there emerged a fellowship and a love for one another, which touches my heart still. And I'm grateful for the creation of that the work together created a fellowship and individual friendships, and careers blossomed. And as our confidence and pleasure in our work persisted through the years and the challenges, we all ultimately, I think I can say, felt uplifted by our work, and grateful for having had the chance to do it. So it's with great pleasure that I want to introduce you to our panel, which really needs no introduction, obviously. I'm going to ask them to speak in the following order. I'm going to ask Bill Kittredge to speak first, please, and then Onyx Smith. And then I'm going to ask Bill Beavis, who's going to talk about the literary history and the context in which the anthology was put together. I'm going to ask Lois, after Bill Beavis, to share with us information about Jim's really important work on the tribal stories. And then Bill Lang will address the historical contexts of the work. And Mary Clearman Blue is going to give some additional reflections on, we were talking about some of the things that were left out and the criticisms of the book. And some of those follow-up challenges. I want to note that Ken Egan and Humanities Montana have kindly provided copies of the table of contents so that when people refer to their sections of the book, you can see what they're referring to. And again, excuse the snacking up here, enjoy the cookies, and we will have questions after everybody has made their presentation. So the Dean of Montana Literature, Bill Kittredge, will ask to speak first. Bill, who owns the West?
Well, I very distinctly remember going to a historical conference. I guess it was a historical conference. You just named it, I think, in Helena. And
Can they hear you?
is this working? Not working? Okay. Annick and I, and while we were there, we had the good luck to meet a whole number of people that we had not met before, really, or never been very well acquainted with, like Mary Blue and Rich Rader and Bill Lang, and on and on. And we were also had bought a copy of, oh, criminy, I've forgotten his name. Joseph Kinsey Howard, a book called Montana Margins, which was an anthology of Montana writing that's published around 1940, I think. And we're driving back over the pass, coming back from Helena about twilight, and we started thinking, well, that thing's kind of out of date. What if we tried to do another one? You know, and we kept talking about it. And what I really remember is that we contacted Margaret, and she said, well, yeah, she kind of signed on to the idea at least. And then we contacted a bunch of friends, some of, people like Mary Blue and Rich Rader and so forth, and Bill Lang that we'd met just that weekend in Helena, and asked if they would be part of the editorial board, and they all agreed to, and Jim Welch, and suddenly we had an editorial board. Now what? All I can say, and we set up a procedure, which was eventually, it took a while to get it set up, and we divided up the sections of Montana literature into about 7 or something on that order. Rich Rader did 2 of them, I remember that, because there had to be a special section on Butte, right. And he got that too. And one of the things I remember, since Lois is sitting right here, that I was stunned and surprised and gratified by was after a lot of work, Jim Welch rounded up a lot of pre-conquest, what would you call it, High Plains literature, Indian literature. Jim said he hated the words Native American. He said, don't call me a Native American. He said, I'm part Gros Ventre, part Blackfoot, and part Irish. Call me what I am, which is an Indian, in any event, what really impressed me was the fact that when I started looking at this stuff, and I went, Jesus Christ, this is wonderful. Where the hell did this come from? And I had never even heard of this stuff. And I was amazed and highly pleased. And it kind of went on in that vein. We found things. You talked about, what's her name, Verna, was a typist? Yes. The woman who lived up to Blackfoot. I happen to know that she typed, because this was before computers and emailing and so on and so forth. Verna typed up a little over 6,000 pages of material that picked by the editorial board. Like what we would do is we would pick things. First we'd find books we liked or publications we liked, and then we would find a chapter or some piece of business that we really liked, and then Verna would type it up, and then it would be mailed out, Xeroxed and mailed out to all the other board members. And
You chop down forests.
What?
You chop down forests.
We chopped down forests. And I happen to know where those typescripts are at the moment. They were in my basement over at 143 South 5th East for a long time. And finally a guy came and bought my papers and sent them to Texas Tech. I didn't sell them to him, but I said, if you'll get those out of the basement and take them to Texas Tech, I said, maybe someday I might want them someday and they can have them, because I don't want them in my basement anymore.
Interesting, yeah.
And they're still there as far as I know, unless they've been destroyed by somebody. But in any event, the things Margaret said were quite appropriate. Didn't take too long before we really developed a sense of camaraderie. And, you know, not that it was an easygoing kind of, you know, there was a lot of arguments, and a
Yeah.
lot of disagreements, and a lot of thrashing things and having to think them over for a night or two, and on and on and on. And Annika and I were talking this morning about what we regretted not putting in. And, you know, at that time, for instance, Annika said, too bad we didn't put Dee McNamara in. I said, well, her first novel was published in 1991. Which is true, Raymond the Weeds.
Yeah.
You know, and so there are a lot of things like that that went on, but I don't think we ever came out acrimonious or feeling bad about one another or feeling bad about the decisions. Everybody's got one or two that they regret. But one of the things that happened when the book came out is I got an angry 2-page single-space letter from Leslie Fiedler about the fact that I had not included a section from the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is a book I read twice and hated twice. So, but one of the things I was gratified,
That.
at least national figures like Leslie Fiedler are paying attention and chewing us out about it.
Yeah, right.
Is Leslie's letter in your archive?
I would imagine. Yeah.
Yeah.
I imagine it probably is, I don't know. It was all the way. And where to go from there, I don't know. That's a beginning.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bill. Annika, I'm sure can go next.
Well, between Margaret and Bill, they've covered a lot of the genesis, so I'll just say a few extra words. One is that, you know, I just want to expand on how excited and involved Bill and I became after that Montana Myths meeting, because we had not realized there were people of such great talent around writing as Mary Blue and Rich Rader. We knew Jim Welch, of course. We knew Bill Beavis, and you know, sort of an ex officio member of our group was Ivan Doig.
Right.
Ivan would come along and come to meetings and wish he was on the editorial board, and we wouldn't let him on. But he was sort of our over-the-shoulder consultant in chief. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he really did help. He's such a good researcher, you know, and has such depth of knowledge. So I'm not going to say too much more about the genesis of the book, because I mean, what Margaret and Bill have said covers a lot of it, except to say that we really, really dug long and hard. We had piles and piles of manuscripts. And at first, everyone just brought in their favorite things. And it wasn't by subject matter or anything. It was just, this is my favorite piece on the West. And then we had this huge jumble, and we thought, we can't deal with this. And so at that point, we gave everybody, chose a specialty that was their specialty by and large. Although I ended up with sort of cowboys and Indians stuff, which was my favorite, but it wasn't a specialty. And that way we were able to kind of organize the contents, divide the piles, and then when the big arguments happened, which they did about every section and every piece, and it came time to cut people's favorites, which we did have to do, the person who was in charge of that section had the last say. so that with fiction, Bill got to have the last say. With early Montana, early turn of the century literature, Mary had the last thing to say. And Bill Lang had the last thing to say about the Lewis and Clark stuff. And everybody finally, when it came to the winnowing part, there was a division of responsibility. And we tried to cut the book to be of a size that would be possible for a reader to read. And we couldn't do it. I mean, we cut and we cut probably 1,000 pages, and then we ended up with over 1,000. And Bill Lang was willing to go try and publish it, and we had a very good book designer, Kathy Bogan, who had started out with Northern Lights. Do you all remember Northern Lights? She was the designer for that and a very good artist. And we got, we kept enriching it with more things. And then, of course, we had to do permissions. And that was a job that, somehow got delegated to the women. Mary and me. And it was a huge, huge job. We finally hired Chris Rancic to help us. But it took us, I don't know, long. How long? Forever. It took us forever to try and get permissions to publish, and do permissions fees and whatever for all of this. So that was kind of the underground part of this book that nobody sees. But we did it. And then when it came time to publish the book, we had a friend who was an editor at Norton, and she was very interested in literature of the West. And we sent her a manuscript. We thought maybe Norton would publish this anthology. They were famous for their anthologies. And she looked at it and she loved it, and she said, no, we can't publish this in New York. This will not go. So we published it, and 6,000 copies or so? I think we had 6,000 copies initially.
She said 6,000 that Norton said was as many as you'll ever sell of this.
Yeah, I mean, Norton just said, we can't sell this in New York. So we published 6,000 copies and was out for the centennial. And they sold out in how many weeks?
2.
1 week?
1.5.
1.5 weeks. I mean, we had a signing ceremony for the centennial in Helena. And one friend of ours was a rancher. His wife had been the chairman of the Montana Humanities Committee Board. He came with a pickup and bought a pickup load.
Oh, Jack Heineman.
Jack Heineman.
Yeah, he did.
Was it Billings?
I don't think so. I don't remember. Maybe. But anyway, so then, they were selling them at Charlie's over the counter.
They bought a carton of 30 and sold them out in an hour at Charlie's.
Yeah, I mean,
at the bar.
we were just amazed at how this thing just took off, this ungainly, huge, monstrous book, and everyone loved it. And I think Bill and I were in Paris once, and we went to Village Books, which is this English language bookstore in Saint-Germain, very famous, good bookstore. And in the window was a copy of The Last Best Place. And we went in there and we said, do you ever sell any of this? I mean, have you sold this book? Is this, an artifact? and they said, we sell about 2 a month. And it just was amazing. Here we are in Paris selling The Last Best Place. I think they probably sold somewhere around 70 to 75,000 copies.
Anik, didn't you say that the book is as many pages as the University of Washington could actually bind?
Yeah, that was
There was
amazing.
no more pages possible, right?
That's correct.
But we didn't start at University of Washington. We started at the Montana Historical Society, and Bill can tell you more about that. He published the hardbacks at first. And there's a whole publishing history that I won't go into now. But anyway, it was a great, great honor and pleasure to work on this, and we became really close friends. And Margaret Kingsland is the godmother of this book. It would not have happened without her.
It was my pleasure.
I'm pleased to
Thanks.
say that this is a Montana Historical Society copy of this book. And those things are worth about 5 times as much as a University of Washington Press version of
Oh, interesting. Collector's items now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Anik, thank you. And Bill Beavis, I know you have important, interesting things to say about the literary history of Montana proceedings.
Well, first, I want to thank Margaret. Is this a decent distance? Can you hear me? Closer? No, okay. She put together the team.
No, she didn't. We did. We
Oh.
all did together.
Well, but I mean, she brought together the team that put
The
together
planning
rest of
committee
team.
for the conference.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And some of you were on that planning
Right,
committee.
right.
Yeah, the planning committee
Oh,
for
the
the conference, the
conference
MCH put
itself.
together.
No, I meant for the editing of the book.
No, we did.
No, Bill and Anik. Yeah.
We did that. Bill and
Yeah.
I. Bill and
Oh, you and Bill. Okay, I didn't know who the "we" was. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah, Bill and
Well,
Anik.
but between the three of them, they did a great job.
They did a great
And
job.
I can't refer to it as a board because of the connotations of serving on a board. It was a team, and it was a hilarious, brilliant, and fun and hardworking team. So thanks to whoever assembled it.
Bill and Anik.
All the coaches. I want to take you back a bit to, I think that the Who Owns the West Conference in 1979, which Bill Kittredge thought up, and Onik, I'm
No,
sure.
Bill, Bob Reed.
Bob Reed, yeah.
Bob Reed,
Are we married?
just the facts, ma'am.
Might as well be. The
No, we're just old.
Who Owns the West Conference in 1979, I think I'm just making a kind of argument point here. It made inevitable the last best place. By the end of that conference, it was clear that not only for a long time had Montana had writing roots, important writing roots, as Joseph Kinsey Howard knew, but things were exploding. So let me take you back a little bit. I was offered a job here at UM in the spring of '74, and I took it. I was out of work. And by the way, in the spring of '74, among flagship state universities, I can't remember when states were created, but let's say there were 51 of them or 50, Montana was 4th in salary scale.
From the top or the bottom?
From the top.
That's pathetic. Are you kidding?
We were 4th in the nation among flagship state universities in pay. Well, that's what they told me when they offered me the job. So it's spring of '74, and I've accepted a job at Montana, and within a few months, I open up the New York Times Book Review, and there on the front page of the book review is an entire page on a novel by James Welch, Winter in the Blood, Reynolds Price writing, beginning with a nearly perfect novel. Okay, and I think, whoa, that's fun. My field was poetry. I already knew about Richard Hugo. I knew it was the second creative writing program in the country. And Hugo had already published 3 or 4 of his 6 books. So, and then later that summer, American Poetry Review, which I subscribed to, I was still back east. There's a picture of a guy in shorts and a fishing vest holding a fishing rod in one hand, and in the other hand he's got a line and about a 4-inch fish on the end of the line. He has a shit-eating grin, and it's James Welch. And I believe the poem was in my first Hard Springtime, which is magnificent. And I already, by the time I came here in '74, I already had a feeling of a rich tradition And I knew that H.G. Merriam in 1919 had been publishing Frontier. Bud Guthrie and Dorothy Johnson were editors of it and publishing. So I came here thinking, you know, this is really cool. The creative writing program is a really cool part of the English department. And then I'll have to check the dates to make sure I'm doing this right before Anik tells me. So, Winter in the Blood, 74. Maclean's A River Runs Through It, 76. Doig's This House of Sky, 78. And Bill Kittredge had the first page of each one of those copied and posted beside his door. He was right across the hall from me, and I'd come into work and see, you know, there were those first paragraphs in the tall weeds beside the barrel pit. The
8 or 9.
Yeah, right. And fabulous prose in every one of them, right there in the opening paragraph. So those were exciting times. And by 78 and 9, we were working up to the Who Owns the West conference, and more people were coming out with more books each year. And I just have to tell you this, because Bud Guthrie and Dorothy Johnson were in at the beginning of this tradition back in 1919. They were still alive. And on the last night of the Who Owns the West conference, Bud had come in from Shodo, and Dorothy had just come in from Whitefish. And of course, they'd been in school together in 1919, 2021. And Bud came up and said with a lascivious grin as he walked in the door, Dorothy was seated in the front row, and he said, "Dorothy, I sure enjoyed last night." And without missing a beat, Dorothy said, "Oh, Bud, was that you?" So I'm just going to stop there and say that by the end of 1979, a very rich tradition had been reviewed and was just growing every year or two with a new title coming out. And I think that gave us the running start that by the early 80s had us saying, you know, there should be a new book since Howard and since Merriam, a new book now on what's going on in Montana.
Yeah.
And boy, was it fun. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
And Anik agrees with everything I said.
She agrees with everything.
No, we're not married.
If you want to see Dorothy Johnson's house, the one she lived in, right where Lola Street tees into Duncan Drive, and across the street, and that little fence over there's a little, and that's where Dorothy lived. God, for 20 years in Missoula. She was the book review editor in the Missoulian. And she once sent me a book in the middle of the summer saying, maybe you want to review this and maybe you don't. It's got a weird title. It was written by a cranky little old man who used to live here. There was a river runs through it.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Cranky little old man who used to live here. That's great. Thank you, Bill. Lois, thank you so much for being here to tell us about some of Jim's process and how the work on the anthology impacted his subsequent work.
Well, I guess I want to start first by saying I'm sort of the surrogate editor at the table because, of course, I didn't have to do a thing. The only thing better maybe than being an editor on the volume was being a camp follower. Because it meant I didn't have to do any of the work. Juliet and I, every time they went out of town to one of these meetings at Chico or Marina Cay or up in Whitefish, Juliet and I, because she was running the dance program, and by then I was not only teaching but running creative writing, because he's let in every fiction writer in America. But every weekend, Juliet and I would get in the car and drive to one of these places where we didn't have to do any prep. Our husbands paid for our supper because the humanities people only paid for the hotel room. And so we got to participate in all these discussions, but we didn't have to do a lick of work. That was my idea of a good time.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I watched Jim work through it. And mind you, he was already on the Board of Pardons, so he had to spend 1 week a month reading the cases that they would consider at the monthly meeting. And then he also had these boxes and boxes and boxes of Indian manuscripts that he had to read. And all I can really say about that is, I don't know how many of you have read Virginia Woolf's Orlando, but there is a paragraph about a fellow, the young hero lives in a castle, of course, which is a good place to live in those days. But in the tower, there was a room where there was a scribe writing. And she mentioned him sitting there and what it looks like, and then said, we're not going to talk anymore about him now because there's nothing more dull than watching a writer write. And probably the only thing duller than that actually is watching a reader read. And Jim spent hundreds of hours reading these manuscripts, none of which I think he had ever read. He may have known the subject matter of some of the stories, but he certainly had never read that stuff. And so he just read and read and read and read. And when you read that much, you don't like to summarize, you only comment. So besides, I was reading my own student papers, so I have my own reading to do. But therefore, I have not much to say about his editing process, except I watched it when we had the interchange, at those meetings that you had at resorts. I want to say too, my most enjoyable evening was, I think it was our last supper, when we were in a basement room in a restaurant, and everybody was talking about what the title would be. If you've ever played around with somebody working on a title, you know it can almost always be interminable. And it seemed to me that night that most of the subject matter was in fact the title. People were just flipping titles this way and that all evening in between every other kind of conversation. And I remember finally off on my left, Bill suddenly said, let's just call it The Last Best Place. And everybody said, yep.
Well, I hate to say this, but I have a completely different memory of that.
That's so good, because I like
so
mine.
does
You
Bill
can tell
Lang.
yours.
Yes, thank you.
The same business was going on, except it was outside of the aluminum trailer house on the hillside above Chico Hot Springs.
Right.
And we were kicking around the titles and drinking gin at that point. It was 5:30 in the afternoon. And I think Bill Beavis suggested one, but I said, what about this one? And I was thinking about Hugo's The Last Good Kiss, and what's that great line of Jefferson's? I think it's Jefferson. maybe.
Lincoln.
What? Lincoln, maybe, I don't know. Anyway.
One of
somebody
those.
said-
Hope.
Yeah, one of those guys. And
Yeah.
That's what I said. Anyway, the only thing is it wasn't in a basement, it wasn't at night, it was out on a hillside looking out at Chico Hot Springs.
Well, since I've never been in a trailer above Chico Hot Springs, I would say at another night we played the same game.
Bill Lang has another story about
No,
the
that's
time.
it, that's it.
That's it, okay, yeah.
Yeah, and Bill said, didn't he say something like, didn't somebody say something like that? And you said Lincoln did, America's the last, best hope of mankind.
Yes, and when Bill said last best place, Rich Rader practically jumped up off the ground and said, "That's it!" Now, I don't know if that's actually what happened or I just invented
No,
it,
that's right.
but I think that's true.
It sounds
He
like
the
Richie.
man.
I have
That's
no
right.
idea.
Sounds like Richie. And that's a nice segue into Bill Lang's presentation. Thank you, Bill. Thank you.
Ooh, that's too loud, isn't it? Oh, is that okay? Well, as a historian and a fellow traveler with these literary giants and minds, I can say that this book and the working on this book made it clear to me as a historian that at the center of all narratives that mean anything is the human experience, and especially the human experience in first person. That's what this thing is really about, if you look at it closely. Everything, poetry, all of it keeps coming back to the first person. It's not about a collective. There's a collective at the end of it, perhaps, that we can say last best place. So, for me, that was an enormous gift. Historians in general abandoned the narrative sometime near the end of the Vietnam War. And it hasn't been too many years since the narrative has come back, thanks to people like David McCullough and others. So I was trained up as a graduate student during the war, to just abandon the narrative. If it's not analytical, if it's not critical, if it doesn't want to hang somebody, it's not worth it, basically. So that was a gift. Another gift that Margaret mentioned that I just want to express is, even though I've been on sports teams my whole life, as most kids, I never experienced the power of a team before like this. And it led me to continue to do that, and that's all I've done since, is work on teams, because it's more rewarding. I mean, isn't it true that writing and contemplative life is so bloody solitary and scary and not that rewarding in some ways compared to teamwork? So, two things that this came out. Now to history, as a historian, I'm forced constantly to always start with prologue. We can go very deep. We can go way back, but I'm just going to do it within the time frame. So late 80s, last best place is right. We didn't know it at the time, but we were right on the edge of something that was coming. And what was coming was the new Western history. What was coming was a frontal attack on the myth of the West. And Bill mentioned Who Owns the West. That was an important conference because it raised those questions. So it wasn't as though we were behind the curve, but if you look at the last best place, if you even think about the title, this is a tempered exceptionalism, isn't it? Historians today think about exceptionalism as the original sin. It's gone. No working historian today writes about that, cares about that. It's transnational. It's transhuman. It's the entire human experience. Don Worster's recent book, published in 2016, titled The Shrinking Earth, is a wholesale assault on the notion that any part of history isn't the part of the human enterprise on Earth and the destruction of the Earth. Now, he's a dark historian, although I do recommend you look at that book. So in some ways, we were talking about something that was going to be at the center of lots and lots of discussions. You know, whether it's Larry McMurtry yelling and screaming about it in anger or not. And yet at the same time, and here's the odd, kind of ironic, or maybe it's paradoxical, I'll let the literary scholars figure that out. Last Best Place is also, in many ways, through all of these stories, a counter-argument to globalism, because globalism destroys place. That's its purpose in a way. And here's a book, and I would argue maybe that's why it was so popular, not just because of the mythic stuff, but also because we knew, we could feel, and certainly it happened, that if we don't hold on to place, whether it's, you know, local food or whether it's local people, we got a problem. So we don't like it for some reason, and yet, of course, we depend on it. So for me, it really pushes history in an odd sort of way, and Montana history in an even odder way. But at the base, I think Montana history and what is in this book that will always work and always be appropriate and always be instructive is focusing on the first person, focusing in on the personal experience in trying to figure out what reality is, which is historians are supposed to do that and then explain as best they can what it means. I would leave that up to everybody who reads it. So that's a short take on that book and history.
Thank you. Mary Quinlan Blue.
I really want to thank everybody for being here and say what a pleasure it is, not just sitting here at the table with old friends, but also to see the faces of old friends in the audience. And that's you, Louise, back there in the back seat. Yeah, there's a memoirist. I want to start, after that, I want to start by saying that the Montana Committee for the Humanities, as it was then called, under Margaret's direction, and the editorial board for The Last Best Place was a literal lifeline for me. I came back to Montana in the fall of 1969 and began teaching freshman comp at what was then Northern Montana College. And I published a few short stories, and one of my colleagues said, "Where do you find those strange magazines that nobody's ever heard of to publish in?" He was talking about the North American Review, in which not only I, but Bill Kittredge had just had short fiction published. And Bill Kittredge and Jim Welch called me in Havre in their disbelief that there was a writer up there.
We were not well received.
But Havre's a great place in many ways. I wanted to mention, somebody was talking about a readable length book. A retired beautician in Havre read The Last Best Place aloud to a circle of blind people.
Oh, that's lovely. I love that. I love that.
Wow.
What happened was I was working in isolation up there, and the 1970s and 80s was an isolation that's hard to imagine now, without the internet, without easy phone connections, without, depending on, for example, interlibrary loan.
Right.
With restrictions on how many things you could get at one time. And it was impossible for me to do the kind of scholarship I'd been trained at, which is why I turned to creative writing. But I have told students, all writers need solitude, but solitude and isolation are two different things. And I had moved into higher ed administration, and it was killing me, and I hated it. And it was the companionship, the friendship, the teamwork, the spirit of working with this group that brought me out and got me back on my intellectual toes again. And woke up the creative spirit, realized I hated my job, and I moved over to Idaho, and things have been better ever since. Now, back to the question of who got left out after Bill talked about, I'd forgotten about Robert Pirsig and the art of motorcycle maintenance. The two people that I've heard the most complaints about, well, actually just one, and that's Thomas Savage. And in fact, at a recent Western American Literature Conference, that discussion came up. Alan Wetzland from Dillon has been really working hard to get Thomas Savage recognition and got me to read several of his novels. I'm not convinced, as Alan is, that he is a great writer. But I do think that we would have probably have included him, but I never heard his name come up. I don't know about the rest of
No, we
you.
did come up.
He was on the final cut list.
He was,
Yeah,
okay.
he was.
Yeah. The other writer that I am sorry that I didn't know about was Linda Sexton from Bozeman. And but I didn't see her book, Margaret of the Imperfections. She's written some since, until after we'd made our selections. We did get a little group of carpers who preferred not to publish, but were angered that we didn't know about them.
Preferred not to.
Just what means they thought we'd be using, I'm not sure. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the question of including women in the anthology. The last graduate class I taught at Idaho was a class in the history of the personal essay, and the students complained that Virginia Woolf was the first female essayist in the anthology. Well, there's a problem there. You know, Dorothy Wordsworth's letters, the past and papers, and so forth, and I explained all this to them and how we could have a 90-credit MFA program, which they were not in favor of, you know. But we did work hard to find women writers, and I went through the table of contents of the literature of modern Montana, which was my responsibility, and I see Grace Stone Coates, Huey Call, whom I've not thought a lot about in recent years, Gwendolyn Hasty, Naomi Lane Babson, whom I'll come back to, Mildred Walker and Dorothy Johnson, and Honora Brown, who wrote a great nonfiction book called Old Man's Garden, which I recommend highly. Now I see Grace Stone Coates got 12 pages, and Wallace Stegner got 8, and A.B. Guthrie Jr. got 10 pages.
Interesting.
You know what? I was really on a kick against mountain men, and Bill Beavis kept telling me to lighten up. He still does. Anyway, in looking at what I was looking for in this material, I came upon a paragraph in the Naomi Lane Babson's section, which I've copied out, and another one in Leslie Fiedler's The Montana Face. And I want to read just a little bit of it. Naomi Lane Babson she was married to a man who was president of what was then Montana State College, and she wrote several novels, and she also wrote a lot of fiction for, I guess we'd call them the slick women's magazines at the time, things like A Woman's Home Companion, Ladies' Home Journal, which I think is still extant, and I don't know what the others were, but she was very well known in those kinds of circles. And when I was an undergraduate at the University of Montana, I witnessed her on a panel with Leslie Fiedler. Now, Leslie Fiedler just let it rip about what he thought about slick women's fiction. Leslie Fiedler was a pretty dominating personality. Naomi Lane Babson stood up to the hurricane. And I wish I could remember what she said about the rights of people to read what they wanted to read. But I don't. But here's what she writes in a novel called I Am Lydian. By this time in the novel, Lydian is over 90 years old, and she's pretending to be asleep while somebody from the local paper interviews her about the past. She was tired of answering questions anyhow. Wagon train, redskins, road agents, fiddle-dee-dum. Folks were mighty funny about the past, picking it over like rats on a rubbish heap. The greatest trash was what they fancied most, and Plummer cast a longer shadow nowadays than a dozen better men who had helped hang him. Nobody ever asked her about the first shingled house in town or the first piped water, nor cared who had bought rose slips and peonies all the way from the States. Whose hands built the grain elevator? Whose the church? Who had put up the first bridge across West Fork? Okay, now here's Leslie Fiedler, and I really enjoy bookending those two since I saw the panel. I was amazed at the time. And he's perplexing over why Montanans seem so preoccupied with their past history. And how so often they'll start to pick the myth apart and they will find things they probably didn't want to know. The figure of the pioneer becomes ever more narrow, crude, brutal. His law is revealed as arbitrary force, his motive, power, as greed. And get this, see how it compares with Naomi Lane Babson. The Montanan poring over his past comes to seem like those dance hall girls of whom a local story tells, panning the ashes of a road agent who had been lynched and burned for the gold it had been rumored he was carrying. Perhaps there had never been any gold in the first place. Now, he's not that far away from Naomi Lane Babson, is he? Well, make of that what you will. I want to wind up by saying anybody who is interested in the literature of the American West should read The Montana Face, Fiedler's The Montana Face. And anybody who's interested in the American West should read Bill Beavis's 10 Tough Trips, of which there is an expanded version, which I have been reading recently in connection with some thoughts I have about my own recent work. Because in that expanded version, Bill has a line, he's been talking about Judy Blunt's book, Breaking Clean. And he has this line: "We have killed the bear, Guthrie. We have pulled the calf, Blunt. What next?" And I think Ken Egan's going to tell us that. Finally, can I just say how much I learned from the editorial board, how much Richard Rader taught me. Richard Rader, I swear, had read every homestead memoir ever published in Montana. He's the one that brought Greystone Coates to my attention. There for a while, Richard Rader and I and John Updike were the only people who'd ever heard of her. John Updike included a 1929 story in his Best American Essays of the Century. How much I learned from Bill Kittredge, and how much I profited by just being treated as though I had a mind by the rest of the people on the panel. And I thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you. Bill, you were remarking last night about how Mary's presentation at that Montana Myths Conference absolutely astounded and changed your life and your work.
Yeah, that's something I was talking to Margaret about. And I don't think I've ever told Mary this. We've been on panels together on other things, notably on Lewis and Clark, which we had a lot of fun with. But in this Sacred Story, Sacred Cows conference, you know, it was going along fine. We were all being professorial and all that sort of thing. And professors in general think way too much of their words, you know. And there's almost a indelible condescension in it that, you know, you just can't get out. And it's kind of, so like everybody else, I was going along listening to it, and I was taking notes on things that I didn't know about, and et cetera, et cetera. And then Mary gave her talk. And I would say maybe halfway through it, I thought, boy, this is really interesting. And then she got into the heart of her talk. And I'm telling you, I almost fell out of my chair. I was completely blown away. I think others were too. And the thing that struck me most, and this is going to sound a little, kind of maybe not trite, but maybe a little too sentimental. I was struck most by the absolute total courage of her talk. And I realized that real literature is potentially the scariest thing in the world. And she made it seem, and this is so weird, she made it seem as though she just stepped off a streetcar. And I asked myself, how in the hell did she do that on paper, and how in the hell did she do it with her voice? I still don't know how she did it. To me, it's just magical.
It was dazzling.
So that changed the way I thought about literature, and actually the way I thought about writing. I've never had the courage, though.
Well, thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Mary. And now, I'm sure that there are questions out there, and we would be happy to hear them. And if you would direct them to a specific editorial board member, we would appreciate that. Maybe people on the panel have questions for each other to help get you going.
Is it time for another? The second to last best place?
Good question, Judy. Is it time for a second volume, volume 2?
One of the things I think people ought to remember about this is that this is as many pages as we could have. And every time you put something in, that meant you had to take something else out. And so there were a lot of things that didn't get in here, possibly, because somebody or the group preferred something else. And those kind of decisions were hard to make over and over again, but they were made.
Right, and so there was an enormous amount of great material that's in those cartons that
You
didn't
could-
get into the book.
You could take it now and have outtakes, the last good place.
The last okay place.
The next to the last.
Next to the last best place. I mean, I have a word of caution. I think there's tremendous, wonderful material available in a lot of the contemporary literature since we published this, and also in the older literatures that we couldn't fit in. But I would beware, because I think this book has a kind of magic. It was a really deliberate attempt at diversity. It was a deliberate attempt to cover multiple points of view and sample them. So it was ahead of its time in that respect also. But you cannot predict magic. And I think this book has a magic in that there are other states that have tried to do anthologies very similar to The Last Best Place, and very meritorious, very good, but they didn't have that magic. So I think I think it would be a mistake to try and follow up, to do a second Last Best Place, but you've got to do something that has its own rationale, that has its own spirit, that has its own magic.
Yeah, there have been a lot of people publishing books in Montana the last, how long? 30 years? I was in on the publication of editing and publication of a book of short stories written by all published after this book came out and that was 10 or 15 years ago. I can't even remember who was my partner, but But that's all possible, you know, but it's hard to know what's going to work. I was just sitting here thinking about it. I think the best novel published in the 20th century was 100 Years of Solitude, which sold slightly over 1 million copies in Spanish in Buenos Aires the first year of its publication, and won the Nobel Prize 2 years later. You know, it's an astonishing book, and it really changed the world in lots of ways, not just Montana.
Interesting. Yes.
I just want two memories come back, and one is sitting in my living room reading the end of the term paper for a Montana writers course. Can you hear me? Yeah. All right, take that, Bill.
Yeah.
And reading a paper from the course by a student named Judy Blunt, and just being knocked off my sofa at the wisdom, the style, the feeling, and I just thought, wow, this is great stuff. And I want to thank you for that paper in Montana Writers.
I got an A.
Oh, so did most of them. That was a lie. But secondly, I want to say that Bill Kittredge, and correct me if I'm wrong, he had either a line, either a mutual friend with Marquez or had been in communication with him. At any rate, he had reason to believe that Marquez might be interested in coming up to Montana for a conference on Native American and South American magical realism, and NEH wouldn't fund it. Am I right?
Me? No, I remember I was at a conference once in Salem, Oregon, and I was going to give a talk about magical realism in pre-conquest Native American writing. And when I got there, there was a crowd that was just beginning together, and there was a woman in the front row who turned out to be named Bella Zawea, who was one of the 3 or 4 great magical realists from South America. And I suddenly went, oh shit. I really didn't know what I was talking about, I don't think. And she obviously knew that I didn't know what I was talking about.
I saw Maggie Davis.
So I'm looking at some wonderful editors, some talented critics of literature, some keen observers of history and how it's written in the electronic age. I see diminishing roles for those people with new publishing, fewer outlets, even obscure publications. So what is the state of writing today?
Wow. What is the state of writing today?
I think I can provide some insight on that, which is that the New York publishing situation is so focused on the bottom line, it has turned to corporate America. If your first book doesn't sell, you're dead. I used to teach in a low residency program at Pacific Lutheran University, and one of my students was a woman named Jennifer Lauk. And I don't think Jennifer will mind my telling this story. She wrote a memoir called Blackbird, which was a New York Times bestseller. Had to do with her mother had given her up at birth, and she got the adoptive parents from hell was the was the story. And it sold an enormous amount of copies, and so she got another contract for a memoir, and they gave her, she didn't tell me how much she got. She called it an obscene amount of money, and it didn't sell. That was that. Well, it wasn't that for Jennifer Lauk. She has gone on to conduct workshops and get into the writing business, you might say. I had an agent who tried hard to sell my most recent novel, Jackalope Dreams. When I sent her my current novel, she sat on it for a year and didn't read it. I am pretty sure that bottom line was in her mind, that she just didn't bother to get to it. I withdrew it. I sent it to a university press, and God bless the independent presses and the university presses, and I got a letter back from the literary acquisitions editor at Nebraska within 3 days. I love it. May I have exclusive rights? What are you going to do? Take their $500 check is what you do, and know they'll treat your book well and keep it in print. Now, there are those who tell you you aren't a real writer if you don't publish in New York. You want to believe them? What more can I say? Oh, I can add one more thing. A friend of mine who's published 6 novels in New York just was dropped by his publisher.
Well, I think.
I'm
what-
sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I'll back that up quickly. After being in Asia for a year and a half, I had lived upriver in Borneo with some of the last hunting gathering tribes on Earth, and they were intact and hunting with blowpipes and spears, and their land was being taken by Japanese and Chinese logging companies for the timber trade. And I did a book on that year, and it was about the native resistance to the logging in Borneo. And at that time, the book was being considered by University of Washington Press, but of course, I'd rather have a commercial New York publisher who'd get it out there. And it was pretty exciting material. I was living with Aboriginal tribes. And there was an excellent New York agent in town, and I won't use her name, but James Welch knew her well, because this conversation was confidential. That's why I'm withholding the name. And I described to her the book and what I thought was pretty sensational. I had the goods on the logging companies. I'd watched the operations. I had insider comments and material. And she listened to me, and she said, Bill, I'll be happy to look at it. I can almost promise you that I wouldn't be able to sell it. And I can't tell you that anyone in New York I can't give you the name of another agent who might want to take it. And I said, why not? This is sensational material. And she said, quote, I'm sorry, but, quote, black books don't sell. I said, what? And she said, everything you're thinking is right. It's disgusting. And yes, these people are Mongolian. They're not black, but they're dark. And black books don't sell. That's the first thing they're going to think when they look this man. Juliet, when did Borneo Log come out? 91. Thank you.
Things are different, I think now.
Whoa, wait a minute. I'm going to go get a second edition. Okay, now.
Well, what I was going to just say is that I agree with Mary. I mean, it's very hard to get published in New York. By no matter how meretricious you are, how good you are of a writer you are, if you're not writing on certain kinds of subjects, if they don't think they have the audience. However, it's a great time for small presses. Small presses, literary presses like Grey Wolf, environmental presses, specialist presses are doing quite well in publishing a lot of writers. And you don't get the big advance. You probably can't live on writing by publishing with small presses, but you can get your book out there. They'll keep it in the bookstores for years. They'll list your book available in New York if it's there, and it doesn't sell a whole lot, it's gone right away. It's just gone. But in addition to that, there are all kinds of other ways that people are writing and publishing on the internet, in blogs. There's a lot more ways to get heard if you're a writer now than there certainly was when I started writing. And so up and down, things are changing, but I think a lot of voices are being heard, and there are a lot of young writers and writers of color I think that some of the books that are getting published in New York are the black books. I just read one that won the, PEN Faulkner Award, a young first novel by a woman from Cameroon. I mean, those are being paid attention to now, where they weren't before. So and small bookstores are doing well. The big chain bookstores are doing terrible. It's hard to know what's good. I just sold an anthology with 30 writers about the subject of hearth, the meanings of hearth, to Milkweed Editions. And we were delighted, Susan O'Connor and I, to sell it, and it'll be out next year. And we'll see how it does. But it's still possible to sell books, if they have merit, to publishers who will publish them and get them out. Like University of Nebraska Press. Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to second that. I've got books from Grey Wolf that I published about 35 years ago that are still in print. And try that with Knopf, it's not going to work.
The friend whose press just dropped him had advised me to find an agent by researching a list of agents for my needs, making a list of 50, and then write all of them describing my book, but claiming that I was a first-time novelist. And I gave some thought to that, and then I gave some more thought to writing a short story entitled Catfishing the Agent.
Mary's happy to be a first-time novelist, and I'm delighted once again to be outdated.
There's,
Well,
I think book publishing is coming back wildfire. I think a lot of people are sick and tired of electronic publishing and electronic news and electronic everything. I know I am.
me too. You're
And a lot of the books like the one Annika was talking about by that woman from Cameroon, there are a lot of immigrant novels coming out now, more so than white American novels, I
it's
think.
exciting.
It's a hot topic at the moment.
Yeah, it's exciting.
And as far as agents go, all I can say is playing the publishing game, if you're going to play it anywhere, in small presses, big presses, or whatever, it's about like teaching somewhere. You have to go and you have to make friends, and you have to become acquainted, and you have to talk. And I've got, I think, the best agent in the world in New York City, Amanda Urban. And she was Ray Carver's agent, she's Richard Ford's agent, she's Cormac McCarthy's agent. It goes on and on and on. She's Joy Williams' agent. And the only reason I got her is because I knew Ray Carver, and Ray Carver recommended me to her, and so she read it and took me. And that's generally how it works, one way or another. So you might as well figure out, it's kind of like buying and selling cars or something, And I don't know why it would be any different.
Some of it's about showing up, and I just really want to thank this wonderful audience for showing up, and I want to give really heartfelt thanks to all of the members of the editorial board who are here, who generously right away said yes. I want to again remind us in our thoughts and hearts to be grateful for the lives of Jim Welch and Richie Rader, who were magnificent, and Ivan Doig and Carol, who took lots of photographs. I don't know where those photographs are.
I've got one.
Oh, good, yeah. And to Ken Egan for inviting us to do this. Thank you, Ken, and Humanities Montana.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, yeah.